Hello, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Skeptic Hangout. It's the Yorkshire Takeover episode, apparently, with me and Jill have just about managing to keep up with what we need to do. And today we've got a very exciting topic, which is morality. Now, it's a topic that's been in the news in the UK a lot recently, with various things to do with tax and members of Her Majesty's government. But obviously, it's something that comes as loads and loads and loads of areas of life and existence. Just generally. We often talk about like moral obligations. I knew someone who felt morally obligated to drive in an economy-sized Honda. She felt it was her civic duty. There's a pun, a morality pun that I've got there for the introduction. It doesn't seem to have gone down very well with Jill, but I'm sure it went down very well. Everyone who's watching and listening. But with that being said, grab your English tea, or in my case, a glass of ice cold dandelion and burdock. Beautiful. As we discuss the black, the white, and all the greys in between. This is episode 59, Morality. So, Jennifer, let's get cracking.
Yeah, I first of all, I want to say welcome back, Mr. Gill. Yeah, what the devil have you been doing? I'm sure that some of our watchers, listeners have noticed that you've been absent for a wee while. Where have you been and what have you been doing?
Just boring life stuff, but I'm very happy to be back. I've got lots of smiles for today's episode. I've been saving up my smiles for today's episode, so we're ready to go. What have you? So morality
indeed. Are ethics and morality the same thing? Would you class them as the same thing?
Etymologically speaking, yes. So the history of the words, morality was the Roman version of the Greek idea of ethikos, or ethics and things. So they're etymologically, at least, very closely linked. Moral or ethical, and those words are used really interchangeably, can't they? I guess there must be differences between the two. I'm not sure. Do you happen to have a very solid idea of the difference between those two things?
I would tend to use them, and I think most ethicists would tend to use them interchangeably.
Yeah.
There is a difference in some quarters where you have a look, and I mean, to me it's negligible, but some people, it's not universal, but some people would have you say that morality is something that is given to you outside of yourself, whereas ethics is a personal code that you abide by.
It's interesting because, like, you can think of, say, people who are undertaking research might have to have their research passed by an ethics panel, but the word morality in that case doesn't seem to fit somehow. But I don't know if that's just because we're used to the word ethics in that place as opposed to the word morality, or if that highlights a difference between those two things. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I use them interchangeably, and I think. And I am quite a pedantic person, as we know, but I think you have to be quite pedantic if you want to kind of try and distinguish between the two. I don't think there's many conversations where distinguishing between the two is necessarily appropriate or necessary.
Well, I think this is a really good point to highlight. Anyone who happens to be listening is screaming at their device. Of course, there's a massive difference between these two things. Why on earth have these two idiots not realised to jump onto our Facebook discussion group and let us know exactly where we're wrong in this area, because I would like my knowledge and life improved by knowing the difference between those two things, if there happens to be a significant one that we're both missing.
Yeah. Ethics, or morality, whichever way we want to go with it. What kind of, because there are different ideas about it, whether there is and I think the main contention in my experience is whether there is an objective or subjective morality. I don't know whether you've come across that as well.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on that, and would you like to expand on that a little bit if you have?
I do have thoughts on that, which is handy since we're in a program where we're talking about our thoughts on things. Yeah, it's really interesting because we've spoken before how I've come from a position of being a theist to obviously being an atheist. And so I came from a place in life where I kind of considered the ideas about good things and bad things to do, good ways and bad ways to be, coming from an authority, that being God, written down in the Bible and church doctrine and all of that lot. Whereas now, a lot of that just seems silly to me and arbitrary. I think there are things which, generally speaking, if you look across humanity, we all kind of feel are good and bad things, murder, theft, things like that are sort of, I don't know, obvious bad things to do, obvious immoral actions. But then there are those grey areas where actually murdering someone might be for a greater good. I don't want to sound like a Nazi when I say great, but where the outcome of it is better than not having done it, or it's theft because otherwise your children are starving to death, which is obviously worse than a bit of food being stolen, for example. And I think you can almost justify anything, can't you, with a real reason. But then I don't know. What's the point I'm making? I'm really good at this, just saying things and not coming to a point. Because you asked, didn't you, about subjective and objective morality? So, is morality, all the things we decide about what's good and bad, is all of that just based on our own opinions and our own ideas? Is it all up for debate, or is some of it concrete and hard? And I kind of generally come down on the side of none of it is concrete, and all of it has to do with us deciding, even like if it's a decision between just me and you personally, like we have to decide that and come to that agreement together, whether it's us as a country in the UK or as a continent or as a people across the world. It's about discussion and understanding and negotiation, and I think it's, I think life's a lot easier when you get to just say, oh well, God says this, or this holy book that I've read says this, so therefore it's good, therefore it's bad. It gets people to where they don't have to think about the implications of any moral decisions, because it just is or it isn't. Just an example of that, like homosexuality is an easy one to jump on, where people just can use a holy text or a doctrine or a teaching or what have you to say, well, homosexuality is immoral, without actually thinking about, well, what does that mean? Like, what does that actually mean? Because homosexuality can mean, and obviously this is just one example of many, many, many examples I could jump to, but like someone loving someone, or someone fancying someone, or someone having sex with someone, or whatever, like some of those aren't even questions of morality, depending on your sort of viewpoint. There's this idea of amorality, where things are just not even in the realm of whether they're good, bad, moral, immoral, where it's just sort of the wrong question to be asking in the first place. Whereas people just take that from authority, don't they? As in, like, this Bible says this, or this holy book says that, my religious leader said this, and so therefore I know this is wrong. But they don't have to involve themselves in that thought process of moral, immoral, whatever. What does this mean? If I was that person and I put myself in their shoes, what would I be? What my viewpoint on that be, etc., etc. I've spoken a lot. I'll let you jump in on all the things I've said that are wrong.
You've said quite a lot, and I'd like to quick.
Well, like I said quite a lot. I had things to say that I was pleased.
I didn't want to interrupt you though, because you're on a really good train. I think going back to the first thing you said, I think your confusion is the perfect kind of example of the fact that morality isn't just a black and white thing. And to me, that's what objective morality is.
Yeah.
Objective morality is this thing is wrong or this thing is right. And that's not how morality works. It's not how ethics works. You can't talk about morality without taking into consideration the consequences.
Yeah.
You can't take about the action in isolation of the consequences. And I think to do so is naive.
Yeah.
And I think in a lot of the conversations I've had along morality tend to be these with religious people who have this kind of naive framework of it being good or bad, or they also there's a set of religious people who tend to push forward a very loose concept that it does include consequences, but they don't have a definition really for what objective morality is. They like to say, yes, we believe in objective morality because they think that's what should be done, but they don't have a definition of objective morality.
Because you get people then defending things like slavery or genocide because they have this idea of an objective morality as in like God said this is good, so it is good regardless. Whereas anyone who actually considers, like you say, the implications, the context, the consequences of any of those things has to come to a different conclusion. You know, like I said, like the theft thing, yes, you could say very, very clearly on paper, stealing something from one person without recompense has to be bad. And that does make sense. Of course, like that does make sense. Who would want anything of theirs to be stolen by someone else without paying for it or without an agreement or a trade or what have you? But yeah, it's that black and whiteness which is difficult. And I think as well, one thing which complicates things is laws in various countries. So like, you know, theft is illegal in the UK, regardless of any really worthwhile, significant moral reasons for the theft. Like law has to be black and white. And yeah, there can be some sort of judgments and grey areas considered in like a court by a judge or by a jury or what have you. But at the end of the day, laws have to be black and white. And I think that kind of, I can't remember the word I'm looking for, but it can like change people's views on certain things because, say for example, seatbelts was a thing where in the 1970s in the UK, suddenly seatbelts became a legal obligation. This might not sound like what I'm talking about, but hopefully I'll come back around to it. Seatbelts were a thing where suddenly they became a legal requirement for if you were a passenger in a car in the UK, and people kind of saw it as a lot of people pushed back against it by all accounts. I mean, I'm talking like I was there. I certainly wasn't. But people, I've seen YouTube videos. People push back against it because they were very much used to acting in a certain way, but then the law changed their attitudes towards it to the point where nowadays it feels like a moral obligation to wear my seatbelt because I'm protecting myself, I'm protecting other road users, I'm protecting other passengers within the car, and that suddenly becomes this big thing. And so like laws can be a good tool for sort of adjusting people's attitudes towards some of these moral questions, but they can also be things which are negatives or subtract from that because people then often see things in a black and white way, whereas in life, in reality, day to day, very rarely do we have any situations where things are black and white. Did that make sense?
It does. I'd like to clarify that, this is regarding British law. So, but I do feel that mitigating circumstances are taken into account.
Yes.
So although theft is wrong in the UK, if somebody does have mitigating circumstances, they will be taken into consideration as to the harshness of the sentence, or if a sentence is given at all. So I think that's very important to point out.
I think that's a good clarification. I think in terms of like, is the law, I guess, isn't written in a way as like, theft is always illegal unless you've got like a really good reason and you can kind of persuade people to, like, the law still states that is an illegal action, isn't it? You know, it's that. But yeah, you're right in terms of, you know, mitigating. I don't know, would there ever be, presumably there are cases where there are things which are black and white, yes, this is illegal, but people being let off because of mitigating circumstances. Presumably that happens all the time then.
I would think it happens all the time, yeah. That, I mean, without bringing any particular examples, which I don't have, so it would be wrong of me to do so. I can imagine, but I think about this stuff all the time. I mean, my degree is in 3 parts. It's and we talk about the other 2 parts quite a lot on the show, which is religion and philosophy. But the name of my degree, the name of my degree is religion, philosophy, and ethics. So this is something that I do kind of think about quite a lot, and it's something I talk about quite a lot, although it's not something that I kind of publicize, because it comes up in kind of fringe conversations rather than mainstream conversations. But I think going back to, I wanted to touch a little bit on what you said earlier on, because something you said really caught my attention, and it's something I've pushed back on before, in that morality is just, and disagree with me if I misquote you, because that's not something I want to do. But morality, I can barely remember what I've said anyway, so carry on. Morality is something that is entirely subjective, because I don't actually agree with that, because I think there are objective facts about life which inform morality. For instance, we are all going to die. None of us really enjoy pain and suffering. Although I would make a distinction between those 2 things, but just for the sake of this conversation, none of us really enjoy pain and suffering. We're all going to get ill at some time. We all need to eat to survive. And I think things like that, objective facts, do inform morality. So it's not just a case of being completely subjective. It's not just a case of my opinion against yours on all subjects. There are certain things that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about morality and we're talking about our personal ethics. Yeah, that's interesting. That brought a few things to mind. So I agree in terms of, like, generally, like, as a species, we have all, and I may be misunderstanding what you're saying, or I may be completely wrong. So again, correct me. But I understand that, like, as a species, we've got the same basic needs in terms of we need to eat, we need to, all those sorts of things. But I think people can still even look at those in different ways. So, like, we could say very clearly that starving someone, like putting someone in a position where they are not able to feed themselves to the point where they starve to death, is an immoral action, because eating is a necessary part of them staying alive. But the Nazis did that to Jews during the Holocaust and other groups during the Holocaust, but they thought that was a moral decision because they viewed them as subhuman. And, there's that whole thing of, like, because they were less worthy than they were of those basic needs. And so in their eyes, I imagine that was a moral action, whereas we will view that as an immoral action. I'm not trying. Is this me defending Nazis? Is that what I'm doing? Am I defending Nazis now? I was laughing to myself actually when you said that, because why is it on every conversation about morality that the fucking Nazis come into it? No, but
you can see them as monsters really quite easily, because their morality doesn't align with ours. And so when I'm saying, like, is everything subjective or are there objective things? To us, it seems obvious that some of those things that you listed are objective things, but those were not, like, those must be subjective, because there are people like the Nazis, as a really obvious example that most people know of, where, those things don't match up.
But these aren't objective moralities. These aren't objective moral actions. These are objective facts about life that inform morality.
But inform that are subjective.
people like the Nazis, for example, have taken a subjective view of those objective facts.
Yeah.
The facts haven't changed.
True.
People still die. People still suffer. They are objective facts. But the Nazis have taken a subjective view of it in this circumstance because of my subjective opinion. It is okay to override this because of my subjective view. So the fact is still objective. The fact still remains the same, but the opinion is a subjective one.
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Yeah, I think your question about why do we always go to Nazis, I think it is one of those though where we all kind of know about Nazis, don't we? Like we all get taught it at school. And also I think, you know, like a lot of these questions to do with morality are quite subtle, and there was not much subtle about the Nazis, so like it's a really easy one to jump on. Holocaust is not subtle. I do want to clarify for anyone who was listening that I'm not trying to defend Nazis as in any way moral, but
it didn't.
I think my point still stands in terms of, you know, those sorts of norms and ideas that we have about things which are reasonable, expected, even like basic minimum sort of requirements for any sort of moral decision, just did not match up with the same ideas that Nazis had, or at least, you know, people like Hitler and those top Nazis had about you know, gay people, Jews, Roman gypsies, etc., etc., etc. Yeah, that was interesting.
Going back to gay people, as you've just raised it again, and you raised it earlier, because that was one of the points I wanted to raise up earlier when you talked about that. It's interesting to me that I don't remember exactly what you said earlier. So if
I think in a nutshell,
I jog your memory, please.
Yeah, I think my point was, and again, if memory serves, people can rewind, something along the lines of people get told that homosexuality is immoral, but is it necessarily a question of morality, or is something like homosexuality amoral, as in it's not even the right question to be asking? I think that's not.
Yeah, and that's what I wanted to touch on, the idea that it could be a spectrum of things. You could have just platonic homosexual love for someone. Yeah. You could be involved in a physical sexual relationship. And it's interesting to me that a lot of I'm going to say religions rather than theistic religions, because I don't want to isolate theistic religions in this, because I do think it's more widespread than that.
Yeah.
Kind of have this idea of, and I'm going to borrow specifically Christian language for this, love the sinner, not the sin. So the idea is that you're not wrong because you are a homosexual. It is the acts you partake in which make you wrong, which is hideous. But let's make this very, very hideous. But it is an idea within religion, and it's widespread within religion. Whether it's Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Christianity or Judaism, the idea that you know, the person, it's the act which is the aberration. It's not the person having those feelings. If you don't act on them, then you are okay. And I talked about this recently in an episode of the Non-Profits I did with our good friend Josh Entner from the Bloody Good Film podcast. And we were talking about Mormonism. And I actually have a friend who's gay, who's a Mormon. And they went to conversion therapy and were encouraged to do that. And they're now living in a straight relationship with children and kind of denying that, because they've got this idea in their head that if you don't act upon the way you feel, then it's no longer a sin. It's acceptable to kind of be who you are as long as you don't act upon it, which is abhorrent. So I kind
of want to break that down, because then Right, hang on, where do you want to start? Because there was a few things that came into mind, and now they've all kind of got muddled up and not coming out in the right order. Thinking about then that in the through the lens of morality, like immoral and moral. Obviously, me and you will agree that loving anyone and wanting to have relationships with, or fancying, or having sexual relationships with anyone, whether they're of the same gender, a different gender, between genders, whatever it is fine, as long as we're all consenting adults and all.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So, like, the question of morality is then presumably for those people who are in that situation. So your friend, for example, who went through conversion therapy and etc., the basis upon which that was all predicated was that those acts or feelings or actions are immoral, which means like ethically wrong. And presumably in the sort of frame of Mormonism would therefore be sins and acts against God. So then that begs the question to me, at least, in terms of like, if that's what that means, if those actions are sins, actions against God, I mean, it's an obvious question of, those people were made that way by God, presumably, or is there another explanation as to why that person has those feelings? Because those feelings are not, it's not like they've been in an accident and they can't use their arm properly, or they've been, like, it's not like a defect or anything. It's just, I don't know. What's the point I'm trying to make, Jill? What am I trying to say?
I'm not sure exactly. I'm going to be honest with you.
No, but I think like, if something's, to my mind, because we talked about objective and subjective morality, for something to be immoral, to my mind, it's got to have some negative outcome as a consequence of it. So you talked about consequences earlier on.
Well, so the negative outcome for the religious person is, or specifically the theist person, is that they're committing an abomination in the eyes of God.
Yeah.
So that in itself is reason not to do it, and reason why it's sinful.
But like, there are religious rules, say like within Christianity, which have real life repercussions. Thou shalt not murder. You can see the very clear in front of your repercussions to that sort of an action. Whereas there are certain things where it's, not to eat pork, or whether it's not to, you've got to dress in a certain way or what have you, where there doesn't seem to be any sort of real world, I mean, I may be simplifying this, but no real world sort of consequences in terms of like the outcomes of that as a moral decision.
I mean, this is not the place to get into this, but there are, specifically in Christian theology, there is a distinction in some quarters of between kind of things that are frowned upon, but won't particularly stop you getting to heaven anyway, or stop you gaining merit, and things that are bad enough that they will actually impede you on gaining grace or getting to heaven, or however you want to phrase it. So there are aspects of that. Yes,
I guess actually then for those people who believe in the sort of, and I don't think it's clear anywhere about the rules and procedures of the whole afterlife thing. But yeah, I guess therefore, if you're doing actions against God, the sort of quote unquote real life consequences of that would be afterlife related, as opposed to real life related now. So you'd have concrete stuff in front of you now, but it will have consequences later on down the line when you
in the hereafter. Yeah. as old books like to refer to it as.
Yes, I mean, I guess that makes sense. I've come to some sort of understanding of that, perhaps, in terms of, going back to like homosexuality as the sort of jumping on point that we had here. Like, me loving a woman versus me loving a man, aside from societal things or other people's prejudices or what have you, that doesn't make a concrete difference on and it's not like it destroys somebody, or murder is a very easy one to talk about, good and bad, and that usually doesn't tend to be a good thing. Whereas loving one person versus another person doesn't seem to have those real life repercussions. Yes, if you're a religious person, you may be talking about eternal repercussions, but obviously us from a skeptical perspective don't necessarily see the basis for that conclusion.
Yeah, that's not something that I'd particularly take into account myself on a personal level, no.
Yeah, but then obviously there's that whole thing then of people who have those ideas then trying to push those on a bigger societal level, to the point where even people who aren't necessarily, and again, Christianity is an easy one for us to use in reference, but like where people kind of assume that homosexuality, because historically most people have been Christians in the UK, for example, where homosexuality is still going through a process of acceptance, and yes, it's becoming more and more accepted by people in society, but like that's still not a fully accepted thing by a lot of people in the in the UK specifically, more so elsewhere in the world. But again, that's the whole basis on that, is the fact that it's a moral decision that people have, a moral sort of judgment that people have based on a consequence which is not tangible, or I don't want to say reasonable. Because people think it's reasonable. That's unfair. It's not a tangible, like real life, here and now consequence that you can see. It's a sort of hypothetical afterlife consequence, and that doesn't seem to me to be a reasonable way to make conclusions about moral decisions.
No, and I would agree with you there, that I don't think hypothetical. Although there's, and when we talk about morals, and especially consequences of morals, we do use a lot of hypothetical situations. So I'm not saying hypotheticals are bad overall, but the kind of the assumption that there is an external realm where this will matter, I don't think is something that necessarily needs taken into consideration. I do want to touch. We've got about 10 minutes left, I think. I do want to touch on a couple of things, and I forgot what the first one is, which is it's typical of me. So I'll jump straight into the second one, and if I remember the first one, I'll circle back, and if not, I'll put it in the discussion group when it does come back to me. You mentioned at the top of the show the kind of difference between moral obligations and the opposite of moral obligations, which escapes me at the minute. But so, a moral obligation, of course, is something that you are obligated to do because it is morally right to do. And I think the most obvious example I can think of is veganism, where this comes into conversation. And we've done a show on veganism in the past, so if you want to go and view that, go and view that.
Feel free to pause this video, watch our entire back catalogue into the veganism one, and then you can continue this episode now. Yeah.
But what are your kind of views on not necessarily veganism, but moral obligations in general, and where do we decide that something is a moral obligation?
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I guess that whole idea of an obligation, because you could say, I'll come back to the veganism thing, but like, if I was walking down the street and I saw a child bleeding on the floor or just on the pavement unsupervised, I would feel like I had a moral obligation to call an ambulance, help the child as much as I could. Whereas I have no, I don't know, that's a moral obligation that I would feel in that instance because of my specific set of moral ideas and sort of the whole framework of how I judge things to be good and bad. And I think most people would agree that that's something that's really clear cut. Yes, you would have a moral obligation in that case to help that child on the street. Am I right in thinking there may also be a legal obligation to help someone like that? Like, can you?
I don't know. I would suspect so, but that's completely
yeah. I think something like veganism though is something where that moral, we're talking about real life consequences to moral decisions. where the consequence of it is a lot further away from home. It's not the child laid on the floor in front of me on the pavement who needs medical support now or they will die. It's an animal 300 miles away that I've not really thought about, or it's I don't know, yeah, on paper I think it's really easy to make the moral case for veganism, and I highly sympathize with a lot of those ideas. I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian, but I could understand very, very clearly a lot of the moral arguments for veganism. It makes a lot of sense, but I think it's one of those things because we're more distanced from the consequences of it, because it is animals hundreds of miles away, or it's abattoirs that we never see, and it's we never see the anguish of a dairy cow who is forcibly impregnated and her calves forcibly removed, or the incineration of baby chicks because they happen to be male and so therefore won't lay eggs. Whatever it is, all of those things. Again, all of those things on paper sound like, well, of course we have a moral obligation to not murder half of the babies that chickens have due to the fact that they're not profit-making machines like the female ones are. But I don't have those in my house, and I don't see them when I walk down the street. And so it's much easier to be blind to those consequences. And so therefore, it feels like an easier thing to dodge that obligation morally, if that makes sense.
So let's skip veganism for a second then and go back to the baby dying in the street, because as I said, moral obligation is that you are kind of obligated to do something about it. What about, because thought experiments are very important in these kinds of conversations, what about if you're jumping in to save that child meant you pushing 2 or 3 other children in the way of a bus to get to
the
it?
trolley incident where we've got
the exactly. Yeah. And this is why these things are so important. How about, where does the obligation lie in that? Can it be truly said to be an obligation if it's going to cause damage to or death to other children?
There's some brilliant Doctor Who episodes where this is the whole dilemma of the episode. So Doctor Who Series 4, Episode 2 of Fires on Pompeii is basically the Doctor...
That's far too geeky, Richard, that you know the exact episode.
2008, it was a brilliant year for Doctor Who. Anyway, so they go to Pompeii, and the option is basically either these aliens take over and destroy the entire planet, or they blow up the volcano, which then kills everybody in Pompeii. So it's that sort of thing, like, we either actively choose to kill all these people here now, all these families, the children, all their animals, everyone here dies, or we passively let the whole world then become consumed by this alien creature, whatever. It's a great episode. They decide to kill everybody in Pompeii in that instance because they kind of already know that that's what does happen anyway. So that's what they do. And in those sorts of situations, it's like, do you go down the route of, well, it's just maths? Here there are fewer people to kill, whereas if we don't do anything, we're killing everybody. It's hard. So like the trolley problem, it's like, we just let things happen and a bad thing happens, or I do something actively and a less bad thing mathematically happens. Like, because it's all the whole thing of like the train's going down the track, some would kill 5 people if I don't do anything, but I can pull a lever and kill 1 person instead, or whatever.
I'm glad you clarified what the trolley problem was for the listeners, just in case they weren't aware of it.
I like that. I've seen a YouTube video where they pose that to a 2-year-old, and the 2-year-old just takes all the people and puts them on the track, and they all get killed in one go. And I think that it's a very good way of solving that problem. But I don't know if I ever have an answer to those sorts of problems, because my brain struggles.
I think that's the point of those sort of problems, that it's not easy to have an answer if there is one at all.
Because I think a lot of these questions, though, because they are big and abstract, like talking, I know you said let's move on from veganism, but like veganism as an example is really good, because it's that whole thing of passive and active. I'm not having to go out and kill a cow and butcher it in order to get mince in my fridge. I'm not having to go out and, I'm not having to do that action. And so therefore all of it is a lot more abstract. And so I think a lot of times where there are those difficult moral decisions, that level of activeness in the outcome or passiveness, I think, has a lot to play there. I can understand people in the trolley problem letting the train go and kill those 5 people because it was nothing to do with them, and I wasn't the person driving the train. I didn't cause the problem on the train track that meant it didn't have the brakes. I was just getting on with my life and it wasn't anything to do with me. Whereas if that one person dies, I did that. And I know that's the crux of the whole problem, so I'm just explaining the problem. But I think that applies with a lot of other things as well, doesn't it? So veganism, because I'm not having to decide whether or not to kill that cow, it's happening in the background. I'm kind of not, the meat's already there in the supermarket. I can just pick it up. And I think that's the sort of difficulty with those sorts of things, where I can very clearly say, I understand the moral arguments for veganism, but I don't feel that moral obligation to do them at the moment in my life because I'm so far removed from the consequences of it.
Yeah, we are coming up to the end of the show. I just want to, I've remembered my earlier points. I'm going to bring that up in a minute. Just very quickly before we go on to that, you've got young children, as I have. What are they aware of where the food comes from animals? Is that something you've brought up with them? Is that something you've talked about?
Yeah, I mean, because we kind of live semi-rurally where we are, so there's lots of animals around and stuff. And I'm a primary school teacher as well, so I always talk about things like this very bluntly about, when we've just been down to the school hall for dinner and we've all had a chicken dinner, that was a chicken that has been killed. Its muscles have been cut off it. We've chopped it up, cooked it, and that's what you've eaten. And when you put it in that sort of, I think because people need to know, don't they? Like, it's hard as well, because that whole conversation is like, well, am I forcing my children to make unethical decisions to do with what they're eating because I'm kind of forcing my lifestyle on them? Because the default is me, because I've said I understand that a lot of the things I'm talking about are unethical, and so I'm forcing those decisions that I'm making on my children, and if they don't know about the sort of moral implications behind them, how fair is that, or how unfair? So I mean, my children do know where food comes from as much as I can, but then, like, I've never shown them a video of pigs being slaughtered, or so yes, but to a point, I guess.
I only ask because, I mean, my wife grew up on a farm, and currently, as we speak, my wife and my 2 children, who are 6 and 9 years old, are up on that farm. And it's lambing season. They're helping birth lambs. They go out and do the chickens. There's coos up there. There's pigs. And they're fully aware that the pigs and they absolutely love the pigs. They love going out and playing with the pigs. But they're fully aware that those pigs are going to end up as bacon on their plate. Yeah. So, and I don't think it's something that is widely discussed, especially in a big city where I'm from, where that thing is openly discussed. But that's for another time, I think. Just briefly before we go, the thing I was going to mention earlier, and this is really interesting, and it's something we could expand on. But I don't think, and I've had lots of these conversations about objective and subjective morality with Christians. I do not think scripturally or theologically there is any problem with subjective morality in Christianity. I think that's actually more plausible than objective morality. But that is a conversation for another time, just dropping that tidbit in there. Richard, final thoughts on ethics and morality?
Well, one of my final thoughts is that I feel like I had more to say about this than I predicted. I've said lots of words in this episode, which is good, and I'm very happy to be back on an episode. So that's awesome. Yeah, I don't think I have anything to add to the conversation apart from I've just really enjoyed the conversation we've had. I thought it's been a good one. So thank you. And certainly, I think we've raised lots of points that fingers crossed, hopefully, people want to sort of continue and talk about in the discussion group. And obviously, people can find us on. Well, if people go to our link tree, they can find all the links to our show in various platforms. So if you happen to be listening to us, you can also see us on YouTube. If you're seeing us on YouTube but can't stand seeing us, you can also listen to us on Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, etc., etc., etc. There are ways to support the show and all of our social media links on there as well. So yes, until next time, this has been me, Richard, and you, Gilliver. I don't know how this works with two people because I'm it's been ages since I've done a two-person show. But until next time, you say something, Gilliver.
Keep questioning, interrogate your beliefs,
and stay skeptical.
We will see you next time.
Hurrah!